We'll go straight into talking about opposition. This is something that Team Taiwan is generally pretty good at, and the reason we're good at this is because we have a structure that fits really well with the rubric. So I'll explain the rubric here now. So starting with questions asked. Now, a few things to note here. First thing, the questions that you ask are also a graded component. So there's two purposes to your questions to the reporter. Right? First purpose is to prepare material for your discussion. If there's things that you don't understand in the report, this is your time to clarify that. But there is also a graded component to these questions. So you need to be careful that you're actually asking questions that are important. Right? And something that you'll notice that's very common, like a common theme inside this opponent rubric, is prioritization and time control. And the reason why this is so important is because as the opponent, you control basically the majority of the debate. You control the discussion. So for your questions, what you need to keep in mind is that these need to be very short and concise, right? To the point, focused, and you should be looking basically for yes or no answers from the reporter. And also regarding prioritization, this means that you should be going from the most important questions to the least important questions. And even better if you have some kind of structure that you go through. So instead of asking just random questions, whatever you think of, you should prepare on a notebook the order of the questions that you want to ask, and then actually deliver them that way. And also don't use this time to ask very long discussion questions because you only have 2 minutes, right? It's really just a cross-examination, and again, you're only looking for answers. Now, moving on to the speech of the opponent. So for this category, you basically want to make sure, understanding your presentation. You want to make sure that you don't misrepresent the reporter's words in any way. I know that it's common practice for you to put a lot of information on the opponent's slides before you actually go in and post them, like a lot of possible questions, a lot of possible issues that you might not have control for. But before you actually go and present your speech, you need to make sure that you didn't write, for example, experiment not well controlled, because that applies to most everyone, and then they did a really good job controlling that experiment. You don't want to contradict yourself in that way. And sometimes I know it can also be hard to put pros and cons if you don't come up with them beforehand, but it's better to put fewer of these than to put a pro or a con that shows that you don't actually understand what the reporter was talking about. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next part, relevant topics addressed. Yes, you're shooting for many or practically all. And this one is a little bit subjective because it kind of depends on what the juror thinks is relevant to the problem statement, but it's fairly easy to understand. You want to make sure that you address as many of the topics as you can, as long as they are relevant, and we'll show you guys how you can do that effectively using the template. And this also relates to prioritization again, because if you don't manage your time well, if you don't prioritize the important stuff, you're not going to be able to cover everything that's relevant. You might end up spending too much time on something that's irrelevant. Okay. Next category, own opinions presented. So not only do you have to have correct opinions, you also need to provide improvements and suggestions if you want to get that 4 points. So it's important to note as an opponent that the discussion is your time to really, really well. Or at least you understand the important physics that are involved inside of this topic. So even though you should be talking only about what the reporter has presented, you also need to make sure that you spend some time to discuss some of the own ideas that you also have. So it's not like you're bringing in your own experiments into that discussion, but you have to provide some kind of unique outside input into that report, rather than just going off of what they've actually presented on. And also keep in mind, when you're doing the pros and cons of the reporter, the goal is not just to point out like any flaws that they might have. The goal is to provide suggestions as well. And even then, the ultimate goal isn't to provide them suggestions. The ultimate goal is to prove that you know more than the reporter does, right? That's the opponent. Okay, so prioritization. Make sure that the impression that you guys give to the jurors is that you are well prepared and you know this topic well. And the best way to do this is you have some kind of structure for your opposition. So instead of asking random questions from topic to topic, jumping between these different topics, if you have a very clear line that you think you can follow to solve this problem, and you follow that clear line, asking questions along the way, maybe taking a tangent here or there, really makes your, it makes your opposition seem a lot more practiced and makes you seem like you know the topic more better if you have that kind of a structure. So you guys can try instead maybe also to have a chronological structure to solving the problem, right? So most problem statements will ask you to observe the phenomenon, test, investigate it, right, and then test relevant parameters. So what you can do actually is using that order of the problem statement, go point by point and figure out what problems they might have and ask those questions in that order. So that's a good way to do prioritization. And this also means that if there's something not important and you don't have enough time, you should skip it. If there's something that's important and again you don't have enough time, you should skip to that topic and make sure that you mention it. So time management, the last point, this is pretty self-explanatory. You don't want to run out of time, and you also don't want to end your speech too early. Because as you can see, if you want the full 4 points, you need to use all of your 4 minutes of opposition speech. And what that means is that you need to be really good at pacing yourself and making kind of decisions on the fly. Because as the opponent, your speech will depend largely on what the reporter gives you. So you need to be able to adjust how fast you talk or adjust how much in depth you go into certain points, depending on how much time you still have. It takes some practice to get right, but in general, the more familiar you are with the topic beforehand, the easier this will be to manage your time well. Okay, so during the discussion, you can see it's worth equal points as your speech. So the discussion is a very large part of your grade as an opponent. And so relevant scientific topics, this is very, very similar to relevant topics from earlier. But it's relevant scientific topics, not relevant topics, because technically in your speech, you can, although it's not encouraged, you can mention problems with their technique. For example, the fact that they could have done more experiments in this scenario, or the fact that they could have drawn this graph differently to show some different aspect. So those are things that you can mention in your speech, but in the discussion, they're pretty much worthless, right? So focus on the discussion, in the discussion, focus only on the science. So that means the theory, the experiments, the analysis, but you don't really care so much about technical issues with their report itself. Okay. Opponent opinions presented, this is the same as before. You need to make sure that you use the discussion not only to find the reporter's weak points and give the reporter to explain parts that they didn't explain that clearly, you also want to use this time to provide your own suggestions, and that will show off your own understanding. And if you disagree with the reporter, it's okay if you can't convince the reporter that you are correct, right? Because even though it is kind of like a debate, you're not really trying to convince the reporter of anything. The people that are grading you are the judges. So if you disagree with the reporter, that's okay. Don't spend too much time on that one point. Yeah. Opponent's conduct of the discussion. So some opponents will have kind of problematic personalities. So you might be a little bit too overbearing, and you might kind of suffocate the discussion. And some opponents will also be too passive, and in that way they kind of let the reporter get away with a lot of mistakes. So you want to be somewhere in the middle. Make sure that you're not, being too aggressive towards the reporter. You want to also be polite at all times. But you also need to be assertive at some times, because as an opponent, again, it's your responsibility to lead the discussion, not the reporter. And prioritization, this is the same as before. During the discussion, you'll usually find that there's too much to talk about during that 10-minute discussion. So during that discussion, you need to make decisions on the spot about which topics you might want to skip and which topics you not want to actually mention or bring up because they're more important than whatever topics you have prepared beforehand. Yeah. Okay. And the last part, answers to jury and reviewers' questions. Like the reporter, you still can't earn points by answering correctly, but you can lose points if you answer incorrectly or if you fail to answer at all. So again, it's not critical that you always know the answer or you always have the correct answer, but at least you shouldn't try and avoid the question or try and answer a question that's irrelevant to what they're asking. Okay, and I'll skip this one. Basically, again, you need to have some kind of structure or some kind of plan for your team when you guys go and oppose. And again, you have the same basic rules. You have the performer, the supporter, who's like the backup opponent, and then you have the computer person, the backup, and the messenger that helps with the communication. But if you guys do get selected, this will be important for you guys later.
So now we're going to we would like to introduce about the opponent template to you guys. The opponent template is the presentation of the opponent. And since you guys are from different schools, likely that you have your own type of opponent template. However, this one is from the previous national champion, and it is really a good version for you guys to efficiently been a good opponent. So I hope that you guys can learn a lot from this template. And we can separate our template into 4 sections. The first one is the problem statement, the structure of solving the problem, the strong and the weak point of the reporter, and finally the problems to discuss. And following our talk about the function of each page and what the opponent should prepare before the PDF in the template, and also the do's and the don'ts of each slide. Okay, so first from the problem statement. For this slide, the function of it is to reaffirm and review the problem statement, and also point out the key point of these problem statement, and point out what the task the reporter should fulfill. And preparing this slide is much similar to what the reporter did in their reports. And the biggest difference between the opponent and the opponent and the reporter is that the opponent did not need to read all the problem statement, and the opponent just only have to highlight the key points. So let's review what the do's and don'ts of these slides. First of all, we should reaffirm the problem, secondary highlight the main points, and we don't read the problem statement again without any explanation. This was just wasting your time. And next, about the structure of solving the problem. These pages may help your opposition be more structured, and it's just like you change your mind into a line. So it will be more clear to let us to understand how to fulfill the task. And also the opponent should elaborate on their own point of view. So the opponent should prepare this slide before the PF. And since the structure of solving the problem will be the core idea of the problem, so it will be better if you connect the structure of solving the problem with your problem to discuss. And I will talk about some common mistakes that I saw in our school, since our school use these pages. And some of the students in our school, and they just changed the problem statement into another type, and they call the structure of solving the problem. Do not just transform your problem statement into another form. It will not help you to be more structured. And some of the students in my school, they just they don't know how to type this page, so they type some irrelevant points, which is a little bit similar to the problem to discuss. So do not type the irrelevant points at all. So again, we reviewed the do's and don'ts of these pages. First of all, we should make the problem statement be more structured and elaborate how to fulfill the task. And we don't type the irrelevant points. And we don't type the summary of the problem statement. We have to use our mind to make the whole structure more clear. And if you're familiar with this topic, sorry, and it will be more easily for you guys to type a good structure of solving the problem. And next is about the strong and the weak points. And about these pages, is especially important in the time of 4-minute presentation. From pointing out the pros and cons of the reporter, we may show our understanding of the reporter's report, and also present our opinion, which is one of the points on the scoring sheets. And we should also provide our suggestion and the improvement in these slides, instead of just talking about what he didn't do pretty well. And so we should use this slide to show that you have the well-fixed insight about the problem. Therefore, never type some some pros and cons which is not related to physics. And here I gave you a pretty bad example that I saw in TYPT. A lot of you guys just type on, have the great setup, clear picture, and the English is fluent, and great presentation. And about this lack of experiments, lack of explanation about theory, and it speaks too fast and they have poor time control. These points are not really related to physics. It will not help you to get points, so please do not type it. And about you type lack of experiment, you have to explain like why do you think that the experiment is not enough, and what is the importance about the lack of parameters. And also, so do not use these kind of problem. And if the pros and cons is suitable for every reporter, then it's not actually the strong and the weak point. So do the things that can be put on every reporter. And last but not least, sometimes it's very hard to find the pros and cons of the reporter. And it's better that you put few points than you put the wrong point which the reporter didn't do. Okay? So let's review about these page. First of all, we should understand what the reporter is actually talking about, so you can point out what is the strong and the weak point of the reporter. And secondly, we have to point out the crucial strong and weak points, which is really related to physics, not just about the English or the presentation. And we do not waste the page on no physics inside points. And we should not type the points that can give to everyone. Then it will not be the pro and cons. And we should not type the points that the reporter not really have. If you type something the reporters not really have, it will significantly affect your points. Okay, so last we will talk about the problem to discuss. And there are two forms of this that we can show. The first one is I am my captain. I don't like to perform like this. And another one is David and biting a river. And actually both of them are quite similar, just the one is with the line and the other is with the back. So you can choose any format you like. And this has the close relationship with the following section, which is a discussion between the opponent and the reporter. So we mainly use this slide to demonstrate what we would like to discuss with the reporter and also emphasize on the importance of each point. So what kind of the problem should we put on this slide? For the same topic, there are usually some questions that every reporter has to face with. And usually these questions are with basics but significant physics idea in it. So if you are familiar with the topic, it may help you a lot to figure out these significant points. And since this problem is faced with every reporter, we can prepare this slide before the PI. And also, when you are preparing for the slide, please ponder on how to discuss each question. We do not want to have the superficial discussion between the opponent and the reporter. So in order to make the discussion be more in-depth, you have to prepare it. Then how to prepare it, you can simply do it by guessing what might the answer of the reporter would be and how do you reply and discuss more. If the question couldn't bring about the in-depth discussion, then we had better put it on the short question time instead of putting it on this slide. And so when you presenting this slide, please elaborate each importance of the importance of each question and instead of just read it. And also, do not put too much problem in this slide because you only have 14 minutes to discuss with the reporter, or sometimes if your presentation is longer, only 7 minutes, and you will have to prioritize your problems. And we only want to discuss about the important problems, so do not put too many problems on it. And you have to prepare these slides before the PF doesn't necessarily mean that you can change it while you are listening to the reporter. Being the opponent, we should be flexible, so never be confined to your template. So let's review about what should we do in this page. First of all, we should prepare this page before the PF, and we should explain the importance of your points and about the priority of the questions. And we do not put too much problems. And if we really put too much problem, then our discussion will be superficial. And we shouldn't the points that can have the discussion. And here are a great video about the example.
Just one minor note about that template as well is, as the opponent, you also get a 1 minute summary discussion at the very end. So actually what you can do with this slide, or with the example that she showed earlier, is instead of actually creating a second slide for that summary discussion, if you follow this during your discussion, you can basically just use this as a summary discussion, right? So pretty much before and after discussion, everything you're talking about should be on this slide. Although you also should note, you don't write really in full sentences here. You don't write the very details, but you write the big bullet points that will help people remember that you talked about this thing. Okay. So this video is from last year, Team Taiwan against Australia. This is our first match. Now, there's not a particularly great performance from the opponent, but you can actually see the slides in this video. So you guys can try and pay attention to see how I use that template. But also, you guys should also notice that I don't really follow the template exactly when I'm doing my opposition. And the discussion itself isn't very great, so it's just if you want better examples of the discussion, you can go on YouTube and search for other videos. Okay, you guys can also grade this one as well, and we'll see what you guys would give for this. So the rubric has space for the opponent as well.
So for your report, I just have a couple of questions for you. First, what is the definition of the height? Did you only take the maximum height?
As I explained in the data analysis, we took all the heights and we looked at the mean height and the maximum height, so reached by the factor.
Okay, thank you.
So we looked at both.
So for your Reynolds number, did you actually make an estimation of what it is?
No, we didn't make an estimation of what Reynolds number is in that, because that's not used in Hayden per se. That was just to describe how flow is described and how it reduces the flow rate.
So for your Hayden per se, are you assuming that it's laminar flow?
We were assuming it was laminar flow for in those experiments.
Yes. And did you consider the...
You guys should probably know what topic this is. So this is Heron's fountain, which is basically creating a water fountain without some kind of active mechanism. So by arranging a certain 3 different water tanks in a certain arrangement, you can actually create a water jet. And the problem asks you to find out how that height of the water jet depends on the relevant parameters. Yeah, so that's why we're talking about the Reynolds number and
the height of the water fast falling back on itself and that changing the height?
Yes, so we looked at the water falling back on itself. In most of our experiments, it was slightly wouldn't fall back on itself, it fell slightly off it, so it didn't really make much of an effect.
So regarding your initial release, correct me if I'm wrong, but you poured it directly into the beaker.
Correct.
So how did you control the amount of fluid that you're pouring into? Because as you're pouring, the height should be changing.
So we use 2 conical flasks that always filter 500 milliliters of water, and we pour them in. We use 2 to allow us to pour in faster.
So how do you make sure that flow rate, the speed at which you're pouring in the water is not
so the speed at which we're pouring in that water wasn't particularly relevant, because as you saw then, there's a small gap in time between the water being poured in and the fountain really starting, so we didn't think that was an issue.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you go to slide 22? So you mentioned here that your fitting values have really large deviation, and C is about a factor of 10.
Yeah.
So can your correction factor actually correct from this?
Yes, our correction factor, those coefficients, can essentially, we average one, we put in front of that, and will give us essentially an approximate prediction of the water jet height.
So So is this with the regression factor or without?
No, so this is the raw data. This is the prediction of values. So that's essentially the difference.
Okay, so you have
So good afternoon, jury. I'm David Wang from Team Taiwan, from report here in Wisconsin. So before we actually begin to look at the report, let's first remind ourselves what exactly the problem statement asks us to do. So just to read as a reminder, the problem statement asks us to construct our Herentz fountain as pictured on the right here and explain how it works, especially investigating how the parameters affect the height of the water jet. And so for this, we think that first and foremost, we need to define what exactly the height of the water jet is. And so we did that in the clarifying questions where the reporter said that that was the maximum and the average height. So the proponent would like to propose this structure in order to solve this problem. First, we need to know what exactly is the fountain's mechanism. In other words, what are the important forces involved here, and what are some possible causes of energy losses. For the reporter, they use the Hagen-Poiseuille method. However, the opponent has some better methods that I think could consider the boundaries between both the turbulent and laminar flow. Then we will look at how the fountain's characteristics affect the water jet. And so for this includes primarily the differences between the heights and also the diameters of the tubes and even some characteristics regarding the water itself. And especially we like to have the reporter further explain some of the deviations in the theory and the experimental results. Then finally, we look at how the height of the water jet changes with time, seeing as the reporter did not do a very clear job of explaining the time dependency of the height of the water jet, especially the very obvious oscillations. So those are some strong and weak points. The reporter did a good job of defining their symbols and their system, and overall they had a very detailed explanation of the entire mechanism, going from reservoir A all the way through to reservoir C. However, in terms of some weak points, we think that they could have better controlled their release mechanism, which, as they said earlier on, although they controlled the amount of volume that was added into it, they did not control the flow rate which was added. And this obviously affects the height A, which would then affect the pressure at the nozzle. Then they did not consider energy loss thoroughly enough, seeing as the well-known major loss and minor losses, which are caused by the tube shape and tube diameter, were not actually considered in their energy calculations. The deviations in the graph were not very well explained, especially the oscillations, which were completely ignored by the reporter. And finally, even though they mentioned the Reynolds number, they did not actually calculate it. And because of that, they can't make sure that their assumption that the flow is laminar is in fact correct. And so the opponent has some suggestions regarding that. So to address some of the weak points, we think that the discussion will go roughly like this. First, we will talk about the conservation of energy. So they did a good job discussing the transition between the gravitational potential energy and the kinetic energy of the water itself. However, there are some other sources of energy loss for of the tubes that they're using. Then regarding the height of the jet, we've verified the definition already. However, we would like to see if they can really actually calculate the maximum height using the velocity alone, seeing as we know the water falls back on itself, which will affect the apparent height. Then regarding the effect of parameters, we'd like to clarify what exactly are the deviations in their experiments. For example, the experiment regarding the different heights, the tube diameters. And finally, we want to look at the time dependence and whether or not we can find an explanation for the time dependence of the height. For example, as we see in the graph, there was a very clear downwards decrease in trend. And so we want to see if the fitted value for that linear fit actually matches with any kind of physical property that can be measured on their experiment. Then we'd like to know whether or not their theory can predict the oscillations. And finally, because the experiment is obviously dynamic, the Reynolds number will be changing. And so we'd like to further discuss how they can adjust their calculations for the energy loss to include this in their assumptions as well. So that being said, I'd like to go into the discussion with the reporter. Okay. starting with the contribution of energy. So you stated earlier that the fraction factor that you use is Hagen-Poisson, and you assume that it was flow, correct?
Yeah.
So how did you actually fit this with your results from earlier?
Okay, so we never put in all of those factors into one equation because we wouldn't be able to do that to keep anything constant. We looked at individual parts, we never actually added them all together in one equation because that would be very difficult to keep things constant.
So what are you exactly saying would change as you were if you were to add this term into your theory?
No, so add this term into our theory. So
yeah, so why do you actually substitute this in? Seeing as you mentioned that you can use this correction, but you didn't actually use it in your comparison between theory and experiments.
Yeah, so as I was saying, in the experiments, to do that, we would have to measure all those different things and put them together, but that would have been not keeping stuff constant.
Okay, so here what you have is the pressure, this is gravity, right?
Yeah.
And these should be constants, correct?
Yes.
So in that case, what exactly is the variable that you can fit into your theory?
No, so what we did was we looked at each one. So we did one where we looked at the radius of the tube diameter. That was the one that had these results. So if I go to that, that's like so like here we put this one here. We put that. This is comparing that part of the relevant one that we changed from Hagen and Poisson and we left the rest of it constant. So we only looked at that relationship. We didn't calculate the constant because it went
So there's one other issue. If you could go to your experiments again.
Yeah.
Just like to see the shape of the tubes. Did you make sure that the tubes were always straight?
Yeah,
or
so
sometimes have bends in them.
So they had to have bends in them for them to actually travel between the containers. We tried to make the bends as gradual as possible, but you are correct in saying that there would have been other frictional forces from the water flowing through those bends, which were another contributing factor to the major difference between the theoretical values for the height and the experimental values. And the flow through those curves in the tube were the sort of things that do slow down the fluid velocity. But in our setup, we had to have the tubes turning to actually work.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so now we've clarified what the frictional forces are regarding the height of the jet. So you said that you used both the maximum height and the average height. So is there a difference between the results when you did for both?
So showing here, this is the water jet height compared to the tube radius. The maximum value was on average a bit higher than the average value of the graph, and you can see that here. You can see that there's a difference in the maximum, which would have been some of these values and the average, which was one.
So it seems to me, since your theory doesn't really include the water falling back on itself, what you are really predicting is the maximum height, right?
Yes, but the other thing to note, often you can see here in this video, that often water doesn't fall exactly back on itself. It doesn't fall exactly back on itself. It has to be exactly perpendicular with no air currents at all to keep it perpendicular.
So make sure that your nozzle here is always vertical because you can see the water is actually blowing off the side.
Yeah, so every time we did this experiment, we used a spirit level to measure that's vertical. But as I said, it was impossible to get it exactly vertical because if it wasn't exactly vertical, it was always vertical.
That's understandable. So because of that, there could also be additional error because of radiation.
Exactly, but because of the angle there is so minimal, it's not that much.
So how can you actually calculate the maximum height? You used the acceleration due to gravity, right?
Correct. So we used our, so if we go to the first one, we used our value for the velocity of the water out of the orifice, and we put it in our equation of motion. The final velocity is equal to the initial velocity plus 2 times gravity.
So my question is that you're neglecting a few forces. One of them is the air resistance, and the other is the surface tension.
Yes.
So can you estimate roughly how much that's going to affect?
Okay, so as I emphasized in my presentation, this was a calculation that was simplified with no frictional forces. It's very hard to control and calculate every single one of those frictional forces. In terms of air resistance, we didn't think that was ever going to be a massive problem and have a significant effect because the velocity of the water was never particularly fast.
Because the height is very low.
Yes.
Looking at your parameters, can you go to the graph where you show the different heights?
Yes, so this one, let's see.
you explain why the error bars for these are so large?
Okay, so the error bars for these are so large. We saw a large amount of fluctuation between,
Sorry, weren't you taking the average value and the maximum value? So why is there a fluctuation in the average value?
no, these error bars were calculated by all the trials we did for one setup. We looked at we took the average of that and we compared it to furthest values away from that, and we saw a fair bit of fluctuation. The other thing to keep in mind, this scale is very different, so it's quite small. So the fluctuation between that is like 1 centimeter, which sort of
The difference of this height, I think, is still quite large.
it's quite large in comparison to that, but it's still quite large in comparison to the fan.
So what about this coefficient here that you fitted for that?
Okay, so this is the coefficient fitted through straight to that data. But if you put in the frictional coefficient, the difference is this average is about 0.17, a little bit less. And if you put that, that's fairly closely gradient there, which is 0.02. So the gradient would be like slightly, very, very slightly shallower. But that would be a significant change from that.
So here there's a deviation, please once again.
So that deviation would have been caused by the value we got from the experiment being a lot lower than it should have been, which could have been caused by a number of issues from the air pressure not sealing correctly, or the air pressure not sealing correctly. The other thing is,
I think we can move on. So we've already discussed what the cause of error here. Can we look at when you change the volume of the tanks that you use? So when you're changing the volume of the water tanks.
we never changed the
I'm sorry, the diameter of the tubes.
Yes, diameter of the tubes, yes.
So you can see from these trend lines, all of them have this downward trend as your diameter gets larger. Correct?
Yes.
So does that mean that you predict that eventually if you have your tube radius large enough, you won't have any water coming out?
Yes, correct.
So you
I was like to explain that. Sure. So essentially, you get to a point where you have your container, and then you get to a point where your tube is so big. At this point, how much volume of water in this container will never be able, there's not enough volume there to simply seal the tube like that, that it will basically only ever fill up part of the tube and just fall down it, which would mean that it would never be
Obviously, you're mentioning for no slip, meaning that both these are always going to be covered with water.
Yes, but if this tube is so bright that the volume of water here is not large enough to actually cover that, it will not work, because it won't be a headline seal.
Okay, I don't think that really makes sense because your theory here assumes that there's no slip, so you should be explaining this without getting into.
There's no slip on this boundary, but the water's not actually coming in contact with this boundary ever.
So then, can you roughly estimate at what point can you not use this assumption? Does this
so the largest value there, which was a diameter of 16 millimeters, so that was 16 millimeters across there. We were already starting to see occasional times where the water would not fill up the entire tube. It would fill up the heart of the tubes, and in that time it would fail. So for that last point, 16 millimeters, we had to do 9 trials because half of them would fail because of that. It would actually seal itself.
So regarding the time dependence then of your water, so obviously there's very large oscillations, and you is not going to predict any kind of oscillation. So can you explain why we would see certain oscillation? Fluctuation.
I'm not sure why that is. So the fluctuation is look at. So you're talking about here the fluctuation height. Yes. So that fluctuation height is caused by, so when you have your water flowing down the pipes, it will build up a bit of pressure, and then as the fan is going, it's releasing some pressure.
So that water is incompressible, correct?
Yes, so the pressure as in the air pressure in the air body between it, that air pressure fluctuates over time.
So you should be able to measure the air pressure. You said that you measure the pressure.
Yes, I've got the pressure dust.
So what is the, can you show me how the pressure fluctuates then?
So the pressure fluctuates. I can go and find that in my computer. It's not running the slides.
Can you give me a rough estimate what scale is it at? Roughly what order of magnitude? Is it really enough to explain this oscillation here?
Yes, so the pressure data was approximately vary between about 106 kilopascals and about 110 kilopascals. So a bit more than the air pressure. And between that time, that was the experiment. In one experiment, it would vary between maybe 106 kilopascals and 170 kilopascals.
Okay. And the final question is, so you didn't really estimate the Reynolds number.
No.
I know that the Reynolds number would be smaller if the tubes are smaller and larger if the tubes are bigger.
Exactly.
So when you increase the tube diameter, did your assumption of laminar flow fail?
So in the bigger diameters, even the, so the 16 millimeter, we didn't think that in our
So first we talked about the mechanism of the appearance function again, and we pointed out a lot of sources of energy loss that the reporter did not consider. For example, the amount of loss caused by the curvature of the pipes, which would obviously affect the calculation of the amount of loss. Then regarding the definition of the pipes, we noticed that their nozzle was not actually pointing exactly vertical, and because of this would cause additional error, and this is the point in the experiment that we could have improved on. Then regarding the effect of relevant parameters, we did our best to try and explain some of the deviations better. And on page 25, the data conflicts with their assumption of the slip condition, but they weren't able to give an estimate on when exactly that would occur, although they were able to give a qualitative explanation. And finally, regarding the changing time dependence of the height, we pointed out that their starting condition does not actually control for the height very well. However, the opponent pointed out that the air pressure fluctuation, the reporter pointed out that air pressure fluctuation is very important. However, the opponent is not.
Okay, we don't have very much time, so let's just do like 1 minute to go over the grades, and then we'll come up with the scores for that. Okay. There, it's fine if you don't have everything finished. Just get a general idea. So. For questions asked, what do you guys think? Anyone put 0? 1? 2? Okay. So yeah, I think the questions were okay. One small issue here though is you might notice the questions weren't prioritized very well, I think, in that there weren't, I guess, very many important questions asked there, and some of the other questions I asked towards the end were actually kind of irrelevant or like leading questions, so not really that important. But yeah, the questions were generally short and generally clear, so that's a good thing. For the speech, we'll skip understanding your presentation because you guys didn't watch the presentation, obviously. So relevant topics addressed. Anyone put 0? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So I guess it's a little bit hard for you guys to gauge this, but I think in general I did an okay job of covering all the topics, at least in the discussion points. And you notice that at some points when the reporter started to talk for too long, I kind of cut him off just to move on so that I could address some other relevant topics. Yeah, okay. Next topic, own opinions presented. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so actually this one is not as good because in that opposition you should have noticed that even though I kind of asked the reporter a lot of questions for their opinion, I don't actually talk about my own suggestions very much. And part of the reason for this is because I didn't really understand their report that well. So you guys need to be careful that in your discussion, you're not just asking the reporter questions and listening to their answers. Sometimes if they give you an answer, you can also contribute to the answer, clarify it a little bit, and this way you need to be able to show your own opinions. So actually in this case, I'd probably go with like a 1 or 2 at most. Prioritization, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I think you guys are being a little bit too nice. So prioritization, I mean, the thing is with that structure just then that you guys saw, even though I did kind of cover the points, everything on that structure sort of briefly, I didn't actually go into more than just a surface level. And so something that I could have done, something that you guys can do to improve your oppositions is if there are points on that discussion, that entire plan for discussion that aren't that important, you guys can skip it. It's okay if you don't mention it, and instead spend some more time discussing some more relevant points. So for example, I spent very little time discussing some very serious problems with their calculations of error because of the fact that I wanted to move on and talk about some other topics. So even though you guys want to make sure you cover all the relevant topics, it's also important that you don't cut off a discussion in the middle just because you don't have enough time left. And time management, 0, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's fair. That's pretty good. So for the discussion with the reporter, let's see. About scientific contribution. This one is important. Scientific contribution. What do you guys think? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I think you're also being a little bit too nice here. So the main issue with this opposition, so at the very end, I think the score was about like a 6 or so, maybe a 7, is I don't actually show that I understand the topic very well. Because even though I'm able to find a lot of problems in the reporter's presentation, I don't actually give them suggestions on how they can improve those problems. And secondly, I don't have my own better explanations for those problems. So, yeah, as an opponent, basically, you need to know that topic as well as if you're going to report that. Because otherwise you can't really score very high in this scientific contribution part. Okay.